Yeah. Without further ado, I will give the word to Matteo, and thank you so much for being here and giving.
All right, here we are. Hope you can hear me. So if you don't, all right, perfect. Thank you for all of you for being here and for having logged in online to this session. Many thanks to Dr. Faustino for having me here and for everything, really, for organizing the session. I would say, allow me to start this presentation by very briefly contextualizing the paper I'm about to present today, as this actually occupies a particular position in my research agenda. This contribution, in fact, is an extract from the last chapter of my doctoral thesis that will appear in August on an Italian journal. But at the very same time, it represents, I think it might represent also a possible beginning of what, you know, I would hopefully like to investigate in my postdoctoral research. In fact, in my, as Faustino, Dr. Faustino just said, in my doctoral studies, I'm currently busy tracking the reception of perhaps one of the most popular of Aristotle's exoteric writings, that is the Protrepticus, in the ancient Christian traditions, that is in the Church Fathers. So on the other hand, what I would like to do in my postdoctoral studies in a somewhat complementary manner is to investigate the reception of Aristotle's esoteric writings in the medieval scholastic Christianity. So you see that in the sense, Boethius, being one of those few philosophers who had actually access to both Aristotle's esoteric and exoteric writings, somehow stands at an important junctions between these two lines of research. So much for the context. I would say, let's jump right into the presentation. Let me share with you the slides. I hope you can see them.
Yes.
Right. Perfect. Thank you very much for the confirmation. So let's jump right into the problem that I set myself to tackle with this contribution, that being the repetitiveness of the surveys of the goods of fortune that in Boethius Consolatio philosophiae, the character of Lady Philosophy offers in book 2 and again repeats in book 3. An interpretative problem which may easily actually represent the single most baffling aspect of Boethius Consolatio, perhaps only second to the awkward silence that Boethius mysteriously kept on any of the Christian dogma in that work. The French patristic scholar Pierre Courcel's own impression of the issue was actually that Lady Philosophy's method is somehow strange in these books. Indeed, as he writes, quote, "To lead Boethius to true happiness, Philosophy announces at the beginning of book 3 that she wants to show Boethius false happiness first. But this review of false goods in book 3 only takes up what was said about the goods of fortune in the previous chapter, and that's the trouble." So however characteristic of Boethius we might be inclined to consider this practice to be, as the scholar Rand noted, Lady Philosophy's presentation of the goods of fortune in the first half of book 3 suffers from, as Rand says, a certain absence, and oftentimes its repetitions are too direct to simply be explained away by reference to Boethius' pedagogical strategies. So let me quote from Rand's article again. He says, the chapters on wealth, office, glory, which are the goods of fortune, in book 3 suggest too closely the discussion in the previous books, in the previous book, without making any very significant addition. Now, the feat of identifying the reasons behind such an argumentative redundancy in Book 2 and Book 3 has historically been a rather complicated feat, one which has in time seen the proposal and then not seldomly also the shelving of a plethora of wide-ranging and often discordant explanations. As we shall see, scholars have for the most part endeavored to account for this idiosyncrasy of the text, either on the one side by investigating the sources used by Boethius, or on the other, attending to the thematic constructions of these books. So as you see, in the second half of the 19th century, it was in fact rather uncontroversial among both classical scholars and philologists to argue that Boethius, very much like Iamblichus before him, worked essentially by compilation, and that, albeit perhaps not as extensively as Iamblichus Protrepticus, Boethius Consolatio itself heavily depended on the writings of the ancient protreptic tradition. The German scholar Usener is undoubtedly the scholar who has stretched the most this paradigm, making it the reason behind the close resemblance between the surveys of the goods of fortune in Book 2 and in Book 3. So in two of his most influential publications, Usener has argued that the study of the sources of Boethius Consolatio reveals that the entire central nucleus of the work is nothing but a re-elaboration of the themes that were already part of Aristotle's Protrepticus, or of a similar but more recent protreptic writing, such as Cicero's Hortensius. Now, predictably, Usener's claim was not positively welcomed in literature, where it was eventually subjected to a multiplicity of more or less extensive qualifications and revisions. For Courcelle, any attempt such as Usener's to find ancient parallels to lady philosophy surveys of the goods of fortune cannot be but superficial, as this discussion, he says, relies on tropes and rhetorical commonplaces which no single author or even any single genre of writing can possibly reclaim as their prerogative. So methodologically, this for Courcelle implies that we have to abandon altogether any tentative of making sense of this idiosyncrasy of Boethius's text on the basis of its parallels with other ancient sources or other ancient literary genres, and resort to more fruitful thematic analysis of these books. So, according to Courcelle, contemporary interpreters, busy as they were trying to identify each and every source used by Boethius, to his contention, they failed to notice that Boethius had hidden the underlying plan of his entire work in plain sight in the closing prose of Book 1. Actually, at a very interesting point in the text, in which lady philosophy, which there acts as Boethius's physician, as Boethius's doctor, identifies three epistemic fallacies at the root of her patient's health problems. In this regard, the French scholar concludes, in the Consolatio, and here I quote, "It is therefore a question of a double conversion in three stages." So we have the first stage devoted to the knowledge of oneself, and that occupies the entirety of Book 2. Then there is a second stage devoted to the knowledge of the supreme end, which occupies Book 3 and Book 4. And then finally, there is the stage on the knowledge of the laws which govern the world at the end, that occupies the end of Book 4 and the entirety of Book 5. So it is precisely on the basis of this threefold distinction that, according to Courcelle, we can finally make sense and possibly dispense once and for all with the strangeness that characterizes lady philosophy's method of exposition of the goods of fortune. These two successive studies of the goods of fortune, Courcelles tells us, fit into the general plan of the work. The first survey, he tells us, relates to the know thyself phase, while the second prepares the subsequent definition of the sovereign good in book 3 and book 4. So, as persuasive as this suggestion may appear at a first sight, I think that Courcelles' thematic criteria, thematic account of this complex interpretative issue cannot really convince us. It certainly did not convince me in the end. After all, it is the French scholar himself that, at a certain point in his reasoning, he must admit that his proposition concerning the three-stage Platonic plan that Boethius putatively said himself to attend throughout the entire Consolatio holds only if we assume that Boethius himself did not strictly observe his own putative plan, which is a qualification which I think makes Courcelles' case rather shaky, at least. So it is my contention that Courcelles' thematic criteria proves ultimately unsatisfactory because it fails to reconduct the interpretative problem that is constituted by the repetitiveness of lady philosophy's arguments in book 2 and book 3 to the so-called living praxis from which such problem might have emerged in the first place, and in perspective of which, as Pierre Hadot has taught us, any such textual idiosyncrasy of the works of antiquity are usually best understood. So what Hadot means by living praxis is actually the concrete life circumstances in which, at the time of writing the Consolatio, Boethius found himself implicated, and in response to which he felt the need of writing precisely such text. So let me read to you this interesting quotation from Hadot's What is Ancient Philosophy, where the French scholar actually explains what his methodological imperative is. It's quite a long one, but bear with me. So in order to understand the philosophical works of antiquity, yep. Okay, go. Okay, oh, sorry. Can you see it like that? All right, perfect. From here, yeah, I'll do it. Okay, perfect. So, he tells us in What is Philosophy, in order to understand the philosophical works of antiquity, as Boethius Consolatio still certainly is, Hadot writes, we must take into consideration the particular conditions of philosophical life at that time. We must discern the philosopher's underlying intention, which was not to develop a discourse which had its end in itself, but to act upon souls. In fact, each assertion must be understood from the perspective of the effect that it was intended to produce in the soul of the auditor or the reader, or even, I would say, even of the writer himself, I would add. So whether the goal was to convert, to console, in fact, to cure, or to exhort the audience, the point was always and above all not to communicate to them some ready-made knowledge, but to form them. If then we remember, he concludes, that philosophy assertions are intended not to communicate knowledge, but to form and to train, it will come as no surprise if we find aporiae in Plato, in Aristotle, in Plotinus, or even in Boethius, I would say. So points at which, Hadot concludes, there are reformulations, there are repetitions, and apparent incoherences. So if we follow Hadot's principle, we come to realize that the circumstances in which Boethius found himself at the time of writing the Consolatio were in fact not simply those of someone who was failing epistemically to understand himself, to understand the ultimate end of all things and the laws governing cosmos, as Courcell's thematic criteria would suggest. No, those conditions, I would say, were actually the ethically demanding ones of a former disciple of a former philosopher, a former disciples of the philosophers, that waiting for his trial and eventually his execution in jail has, in the meantime, given in to despair and to sorrow. And as a consequence of someone who has failed to live up to the philosophical ideal of death and life set by his predecessors, Socrates in Primis. But in fact, I would say that it is arguably driven by these conditions, this existential condition, that Boethius decided to take up paper and ink and write in his cell. His purpose in writing the Consolatio was thus to console himself on his hardships and exhort himself once again to embrace philosophy. All of this via the fictitious literary medium of a personification of philosophy, namely lady philosophy. So this existential perspective in which I propose to read the Consolatio imposes a shift in the very criteria that we might derive from reading the medical analogy by which Boethius, the author, decides to stage his troubled spiritual condition in the text. A shift away from the three causes of Boethius's illness, as they were highlighted by Courcell, and towards the two illnesses themselves that lady philosophy diagnoses to Boethius in book 1, but also a shift towards the dedicated treatments that lady philosophy will administer to her patient in the following books. So as we shall see, these elements from the medical analogy of the Consolatio provide us with a much more effective thematic criteria by which distinguishing the catalogs of the goods of fortune that lady philosophy lays down at the end of book 2 and repeats at the beginning of book 3. The first survey, and this is my claim, that the first survey of the goods of fortune is part of a series of consolatory discourses that, as poultices, as fomenta in the Latin, lady philosophy administers to Boethius throughout book 2 in order to console him on his misfortunes and also to dispel the passions that obnubilate his reasoning. That is to say, to treat Boethius's morbus perturbationum, that is Boethius's disorder of the passions. While the second survey of the goods of fortune is the so-called apotreptic part of a protreptic, of an exhortative discourse that, as a remedy, as a remedium, lady philosophy hands out to her patient in book 3 in order to awaken him from his temporary slumber, from his lethargy, his morbus lethargus, and to bring him back to the philosophical way of living and inevitably also, in his case, of dying. But let's move now to the diagnostic part, which occupies the entirety of book 1. With the opening prose, Boethius inaugurates the series of medical analogies that will govern and structure the development of at least the first 3 books. In this way, presenting his alter ego in the text and lady philosophy as patient and doctor, respectively, as patient and physician, respectively. Boethius thus ascribes a multiplicity of ailments to his alter ego, and as a consequence, a variety of diagnostic and therapeutic methods to his physician. At her first intervention, at her entrance, really, in the dialogue, at the moment in which she drives away the muses of poetry that you can see here represented in the slide, there, lady philosophy immediately identifies in Boethius an ager, a sick man, and reclaims from the sirens of poetry the right to cure him and to heal him with her own muses. The contrast in appearance between patient and physician actually helps us identify by which ailments Boethius seems to be initially afflicted. Whereas lady philosophy enters the scene with, we are told, glowing eyes that penetrated more powerfully than those of ordinary folk, Boethius' vision is so impaired that he will not even be able to recognize his own physician until well to the third prose. My eyes were obfuscated and blinded with tears, he tells us. I could not identify this woman. Moreover, if lady philosophy presents herself with the venerable, awe-inspiring look, Boethius's own face, as he tells us himself, was heavy with grief and bowed down and bowed to the ground with sorrow. But as the development of the scene in Book 1 shows, a temporarily obfuscated vision and a prostrate and grief-ridden countenance actually hardly exhaust the state of distress of the soul, the perturbatio mentis, of which Boethius is said to be suffering. These are, in fact, but a few of a multitude of symptoms that apparently trouble the patient Boethius, and that, as we shall now see, will induce his physician to diagnosticate only at her first guess a case of lethargy. So this is the first diagnosis. As well into their encounter, in fact, Boethius still struggles a lot, even struggles up to the point that he is unable to recognize his own doctor. Lady philosophy launches her first diagnostic attempt. As Boethius recounts, quote, on seeing that I was not merely silent, but utterly speechless and struck dumb, she placed her hand gently on my breast and said, but his condition is not dangerous. He is suffering from lethargy, a weakness common to deluded minds. He has temporarily forgotten himself, but he will soon remember once he has identified me first, end quote. Now, the scholar Schmidt persuasively demonstrated that the description of Boethius' ailments in the Consolatio actually attends very closely to the symptomatological accounts of lethargic cases that were reported in ancient medical literature. According to the scholar, in fact, Boethius chose to associate this particular condition to his alter ego for one particular reason. In fact, in ancient medical literature, lethargy was considered the typical disease of the dark, an ailment that was closely associated, especially with the faculty of vision. As the German scholar has argued, in fact, this visual element associated with lethargy easily allowed Boethius to bring into play what he calls the illumination metaphysics that played such an important role in Platonism and then in Neoplatonism. As a matter of fact, lady philosophy preliminarily set herself to treat her patient by precisely, as we are told, dispelling the clouds of worldly worries that obscured Boethius' vision with the metaphorical gesture of wiping his tearful eyes. Now, lady philosophy's hopes to awaken Boethius first to his physician and only then to himself are only partially realized at this therapeutic stage. In fact, if the patient does eventually recognize his doctor, philosophy's first attempt in Prosa 3 to treat Boethius' self-forgetfulness and to remind Boethius that he himself is, after all, a philosopher, this attempt fails miserably. In fact, for all the references to the ancient philosophers' tragic death that lady philosophy mentions to him, from Socrates' hemlock to the persecutions suffered by Canius, Seneca, and Soranus, Boethius rather than letting these examples sink in as a reminder of his identity, he cannot help but behave like the proverbial donkey listening to the lyre, which is to say, overwhelmed by his own suffering, he turned deaf ears to these examples and pitifully bursts into tears once again. And now let's move to the second diagnostic attempt, that of the disorder of the passions, the morbus perturbationum. So Boethius's complete unresponsiveness to Lady Philosophy's treatment raises her suspicion that she may have possibly misdiagnosed, or at least only partially diagnosed, her patient's condition, and that she may be dealing with something more complicated than a relatively simple case of lethargy. So thus, with a little impatience, at a certain point, she asks him, reciting an Homeric verse, "Why are you weeping?" she says, "with the tears running down your cheek. Out with it, nor hold it fast within your breast. If you seek the physician's help, you must uncover the wound. You must uncover the vulnus." So what the following passage reveals of her patient's condition exceeds Lady Philosophy's worst diagnostic expectations. At the source of Boethius's vulnus, of his wound, as he himself uncovers it, there seems to be laying both the whims of fortune and worldly injustice. "For myself," Boethius tells us, "I have been parted from my possessions, I've been stripped of my offices, blackened in my reputation, and punished for the services I have rendered." End quote. So the passionate and a trait violent fashion in which Boethius exposed and defended his case before Lady Philosophy makes her realize another important aspect of her patient's condition, and finally also delineate a second alternative treatment pathway. So the violence, the vehemence with which Boethius accused the Senate of injustice, the way he grieved for the accusations that are leveled at philosophy, and the way he lamented the damaging of philosophy's reputation. But above all, the very way in which he inveighed against fortune's whims. He complained about the rewards and punishments of this world, and the way in which at the close of his fierce verses, he prayed for the heavens and earth to be governed by the same law of retribution. All of this, according to Lady Philosophy, suggests that Boethius's disease, that is to say his lethargy, is further aggravated, indeed tumorized, as we will see, by a worrisome disorder of the passions, a morbus perturbationum, one which will require a special medical care. She says, "This welter of disturbed emotions weighs heavily upon you. Grief, anger, and melancholy are tearing you apart. So in your present state of mind, you are not as yet fit to face stronger remedies. For the moment, then, I shall apply gentler ones, so that those ailments that hardened to form a tumor because of the passions that have flown in it may soften under a more caressing touch and may become ready to bear the application of more painful treatment." End quote. So we now understand retrospectively why Lady Philosophy's first attempt at treating Boethius's lethargy did not deliver the expected results. So the flow of passions in Boethius's soul had hardened his morbus, had hardened his disease to such an extent to render ineffective common therapeutic responses. As we are told, each of these two diseases afflicting the patient, that is the tumorized lethargy and the disorder of the passions that alimented the tumorized lethargy, are to be treated separately with dedicated medicines. So Boethius's lethargy will be eventually eradicated by remedia validiora, by stronger remedies. while the disorder of the passions is initially treated by legnora, by gentler medicaments, the exact composition and posology of which will become clear only as we proceed with our discussion. But let's now move to the third and last diagnostic step. As convincing as the diagnosis may be, as this diagnosis may be, Lady Philosophy does not seem to be able to make sense of how her former pupil may have possibly developed such acute diseases. To understand the causes of Boethius's illness, as any good clinician, as any good doctor would do, thus Lady Philosophy decides to subject her patient's mind to a final visit, to a final test. Lady Philosophy's clinical interview is interestingly modeled on the Socratic method described in the Platonic dialogues. Starting from a notion on which the two parties agree upon, philosophy little by little brings her patient to reveal his epistemological flaws and therefore his ignorance. So the starting point of this dialogical passage is thus the conviction that God superintends his creation, which is to say, the course of the world is not governed by accident, but it follows a rational principle, which is a proposition that, notwithstanding his momentary confusion, has Boethius so convinced of its truthfulness that Boethius will declare actually at a certain point that he's ready to never let it go. So Boethius' seemingly unshakable convincement on the rationality of the cosmos actually leaves his physician completely astonished, alimenting her curiosity on the case. So we may reconstruct at this point Lady Philosophy's line of thought, diagnostic line of thought, as follows. So if Boethius's mind is now clouded by passion, by the passions, these passions must have breached somewhere. They must have found their way into Boethius's mind. But where? That's the question. Where are these missing elements, and what are these missing elements in Boethius's system of belief that may have rendered his ethical constitution penetrable by the passions? So in the subsequent paragraphs, three such leaks are actually identified by Lady Philosophy. First, despite being assured that it is indeed God that governs the cosmos, Boethius demonstrates himself fundamentally incapable of understanding and let alone answering the following question. How do you envisage, how do you imagine God wielding the reins? Which is to say, what are the instruments of God's governance? How does God govern the world? Second, despite knowing that God is the principle of everything, Boethius's grief, his pain, also prevented him from recalling the answer to the following question. What is the final purpose of the world, the goal to which the whole order of nature proceeds? So these are the first two flaws from where arguably the passions now agitating Boethius's mind infiltrated him. So Lady Philosophy tells us here, I was certainly not mistaken in assuming some defect in your makeup. It is like a gap in a fortified rampart through which the disease of emotional disturbance, the morbus perturbationum, has permeated into your mind. However, the third and most worrying ignorance of all, standing at the source of Boethius's health problems, concerns the knowledge of what essentially a human being is. So let me direct now your attention to this brief dialogical passage. There, Lady Philosophy asks Boethius, can you define what a man is? And Boethius's reply, are you asking if I'm aware that I'm a mortal creature endowed with reason? Yes, I know that, and I proclaim it, Boethius says. But are you aware of being anything more, she asks, No, nothing more, Boethius concludes. So these three forms of ignorances, as I pointed out at the beginning of this talk, are the very same three that Courcelle, as we have seen, chose to elect as the organizing principle of the entire work. Their unveiling at this point in the Consolatio actually marks the end of the long diagnostic process occupying the entirety of Book 1. And at the very same time, it announces the beginning of the therapy in the following books. So I have now fully elicited the causes of your illness, Lady Philosophy says, and the means of recovering your health, end quote. So Boethius's Lethargus, as Lady Philosophy now summarizes her clinical findings, is to be attributed to three causes. First, she says, forgetting who you are has made you confused. And this is why you're upset at being both exiled and stripped of your possessions. Second, she says, since you are unaware of the goal to which the creation proceeds, you imagine that wicked and unprincipled individuals are powerful and blessed. And thirdly, and finally, she says, since you have forgotten the reins that control the world, you believe that the changes of fortune which have befallen you are random and unguided, end quote. So we now have finally an exhaustive picture of Boethius's condition, of its causes, and perhaps more importantly, of the therapeutic treatment that he will undergo. As we shall see, Lady Philosophy will cure Boethius's disorder of the passions by means of fomenta, that is poultices, and his lethargy by means of remedia, that is remedies. In fact, she says at a certain point, it is not yet time for stronger remedies. She says this addressed to Boethius. So I shall try for a little while, break up this cloud of passion and limited poultices, so that once the darkness of deceiving emotions is dispersed, you can acknowledge the brightness of the true light, end quote. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, my contention is that it is this distinction between remedies and fomenta and poultices, rather than the distinction between the three causes of Boethius's ailments that Courcelle proposed that constitute actually the most effective criteria by which distinguishing and by which resolving the idiosyncrasies of Lady Philosophy's review of the goods of fortune in Book 2 and in Book 3. But now I would say let's move rapidly to the therapeutic part of the Consolatio, starting from fomenta, from the poultices, which, as we shall see, are a series of consolatory discourses meant to cure Boethius of his disorder of the passions. So at the onset of Book 2, Lady Philosophy announces to her patient that the time has now finally come for him to start his treatment with the already prescribed poultices, starting with something soothing and pleasurable in order to progress later with stronger draughts. So this gentler fomenta, as we are told, will be administered by means of the persuasion of sweet-sounding rhetoric. Starting from such premises, Lady Philosophy's discourse will actually resort to a series of conventional consolatory strategies that Cicero had already listed in his Tusculan Disputations, and to which Cicero himself will resort in his own Consolatio, in his own writing, the Consolatio. So let me quote this passage. Some hold, Cicero tells us, that the comforter has only one responsibility, which is to teach the suffered that what happened is not an evil at all. This is the view of Cleanthes. Others, including the Peripatetics, would teach that it is not a great evil. Still others for instance, Epicurus, would draw attention away from evils and towards good things. And there are yet others, like the Cyrenaics, who think it's sufficient to show that nothing has happened contrary to expectation. Finally, there are those who bring together all these types of consolation, since different methods work for different people. In my consolatio, Cicero concludes, I combine virtually all these methods into a single speech of consolation. For my mind, and this is an interesting bit, for my mind, he tells us, was swollen, was tumorized, and I was trying out every remedy I could, end quote. So as we shall see, very much like Cicero himself, whose mind is also swollen, is also tumorized, Boethius recurs to virtually all of these consolatory methods together throughout the whole book too, starting with the Cyrenaic method. But the Cyrenaic method is the first one that Lady Philosophy administers to Boethius, showing him that fickleness or mutability is exactly the defined feature of fortune, and that nobody can really reasonably expect fortune to be any different. So Boethius' response to this preliminary treatment is actually interesting, as it is the patient himself this time that laments the inefficacy of this consolatory poultice, of these medicaments, for a case as serious as his. He says, true, these are plausible arguments, thickly smeared as they are with the sweet honey of rhetoric and music. They afford momentary pleasure as we listen to them. But when people are unhappy, as in Boethius's case, awareness of their misery runs deeper. So once these words cease to echo in our ears, the grief implanted in our hearts outweighs them, end quote. So to Boethius's complaints, Lady Philosophy rejoins, repeating once again her assigned treatment pathway, taking this time even more care to stress the different therapeutic functions associated with the prescribed medications. She says, the fact is that as yet such words are no remedy, are no remedia. At this stage, they serve merely as a poultice for the pain which stubbornly resists all healing. When the time is ripe, she concludes, I shall apply remedies to penetrate deep within the skin. So at this point, Boethius's own perplexities on the suitability of Lady Philosophy's therapy impose her a change of consolatory strategy. So in prose 3 and 4 of the text, Lady Philosophy does tests on her patient the Epicurean consolatory method. That is to say, to divert Boethius's attention away from his peasant misfortunes, namely the so-called avocatio, and to direct his attention towards the fortunes that he enjoyed in his past, and the many more that, despite his unfortunate circumstances, is still lucky enough to be enjoying in the present. So after all, as Lady Philosophy reminds Boethius, as an orphan, Boethius was adopted and cared by a good family. Marrying Symmachus' daughter, he became part of one of the leading families of Rome. He and eventually also his own sons enjoyed political offices and a great deal of popularity. Moreover, of all of these goods that fortune lent to Boethius, he is still enjoying perhaps the most precious of them, namely Symmachus, his father-in-law, is still well and alive. His wife as well lives on, and his sons still enjoy their consular ranks. So relevantly for my purposes, to Lady Philosophy's Epicurean consolatory discourse, there follows next the so-called Aristotelian section of the Consolatio, the one that the German Usner famously regarded as being an entire readaptation from the Protrepticus. that is to say, a detailed survey of the goods of fortune, among which we count riches, political offices, and glory. As Lady Philosophy opens the fifth prose, she says, now that the warming poultices of my arguments are penetrating more deeply below your skin, I must, I think, make the dressing stronger. So differently from what scholars have so far been suggesting, I think it is rather evident at this point that Lady Philosophy is not here suggesting the passage to different types of medicaments. That is to say, the passage from fomenta to remedia, which are actually here not even mentioned. And if you think of it, why would they even be mentioned at this point? Because Boethius has evidently not yet recovered from his disorder of the passions. So my interpretation would be that Lady Philosophy is here actually proposing the passage to stronger compositions of the very same medicaments, of the very same fomenta, which is to say, she's suggesting the passage from lighter to stronger fomenta, poultices. As a confirmation of this interpretation, we see that the stronger poultice, the validius fomentum, that Lady Philosophy will administer to her patient, starting with prose number 5, is yet another of the consolatory methods listed in Cicero's Tusculans, which is to say, the one devised by the Stoic Cleanthes, or somewhat similarly by the Peripatetics, which is to say, to teach to the one who is suffering that what happened is either not an evil at all, or at least is not a great evil. In fact, in the second half of book 2, Lady Philosophy takes it upon herself to demonstrate to Boethius that the gifts of fortune are only relatively and not absolute goods, goods whose loss any rational human being would regard as being either, in fact, not an evil at all, as per Cleanthes, or only as a minor evil. But now let's proceed to the end of the therapeutic section of the Consolatio, the one devoted to remedies. I think we can find additional evidence here in favor of my thesis that the last passage, the passage that I've just quoted, does not really mark the beginning of the administration of remedies in the opening prosa of book 3. It is in fact here that Boethius himself, showing encouraging signs of recovery from his disorder of the passions, requests his physician to pass to the second stage of the prescribed treatment pathway. He says, addressing Lady Philosophy, "You are indeed the greatest comfort for weary spirits. What a refreshment you have brought me with the depth of your judgment and the sweetness of your bonds. I no longer count myself unable to bear the future blows of fortune, so far from dreading those remedies, those remedia, which you said would sting a little more. I'm eager to hear them now, and I pressingly demand them," end quote. So it seems that thanks to the sweetness of Lady Philosophy consolatory discourses, Boethius seems now to be fully on board with the therapeutic plan. Lady Philosophy is pleased by her patient's positive response to the treatment, and following his requests, she finally concedes to administer him the remedia for his lethargy. She says, "The medicines remaining for you to take are the kind which are bitter on the tongue, but sweet when swallowed. As for your saying that you're keen to hear them, your enthusiasm would grow white hot if you realize the goal to which I intend now to lead you," end quote. So as Lady Philosophy reveals soon enough to her patient, where she is intending to lead him is actually to true happiness. Also at this therapeutic stage, as in the first, however, Lady Philosophy's approach is cautious and gradual. To Boethius's enthusiastic request that she shows him without hesitation where true happiness resides, she replies, I shall do so and gladly for your sake. But I first shall try to depict and express in words something more familiar to you. And once you have that in mind, you can turn your gaze in the other direction and acknowledge the beauty of true happiness. So that which, according to lady philosophy, Boethius is already familiar with, and in contrast to which he will eventually be able to recognize what true happiness is the very same set of external goods that were already discussed in the second part of Book 2, and that now will again be taken up in the first half of Book 3. That is to say, wealth, office, kingship, and with the addition of carnal pleasures. So as some scholars did not fail to notice, this bipartition of Book 3 of the Consolatio into a pars destruens intended to demonstrate the vanity of the goods of fortune on the one hand, and on the other, pars construens, a constructed part meant to show the nature of true happiness, actually clearly reflects the conventional organization of ancient protreptic discourses, of ancient exhortative discourses. In fact, these exhortative forms of discourse were themselves structured into a so-called apotreptic and a properly protreptic part, which is to say, a part intended to dissuade someone from engaging into something, and on the other hand, a part intended to exhort someone to engage into something, to some activities, in this case, philosophy. So if any doubt should persist at this stage concerning the specifically protreptic rather than consolatory character of this second survey of the goods of fortune, suffice it here to attend to these two considerations. So firstly, we note that the eudaimonistic axiom in which both Cicero's Hortensius, but also Aristotle's Protrepticus had their beginning, appears precisely at this point in the narrative of Boethius' Consolatio, where we are told that mortal creatures have one overall concern, which is to say, a happiness. Moreover, in the conclusive prose of the apotreptic portion of Book 3, we find lady philosophy scorning the search for material goods and, on the other side, promoting the quest for spiritual goods in a way which is entirely analogous to that of fragment B105 of Aristotle's Protrepticus, which I here report rapidly to ease the comparison. Let's move to some conclusive remarks and see what we have learned so far. So my study, I really hope, has shown that, as Hadot repeatedly suggested throughout his body of work, the most effective way of making sense of the textual idiosyncrasies of any ancient work, as Boethius Consolatio still undoubtedly is, I think, even if perhaps the last one of them, is by reconducting these textual idiosyncrasies to the living praxis from which they might have originally emerged. And these circumstances, in Boethius's case, are the unenviable ones of his spiritual unrest while being imprisoned, waiting for his execution in Pavia. So as I suggested, it is precisely reading the medical analogy from this existential perspective that we can best account for the repetitiveness of lady philosophy's surveys of the goods of fortune in Book 2 and Book 3. The first catalog is part of a series, as we have seen, of consolatory discourses that are administered to Boethius throughout Book 2 with the intention of consoling him on his misfortunes and to dispel the passions that confuse his judgment. The second survey is technically the apotreptic part of an exhortative discourse that Boethius is being handed out in Book 3 with the purpose of awakening him from his slumber, from his lethargy actually, and to convert him back to the philosophical way of living. So in conclusion, allow me to qualify one of the most influential studies on this passage of the Consolatio, early on published by the Italian scholar Alfonsi. Alfonsi correctly observed that in between book 2 and book 3, Boethius has, he says, wisely managed to combine the two genres into one. That is to say, the consolatory on the one side, and on the other, the protractic genre of writing. However, I would argue, I don't think Boethius did so in the specific way in which the Italian scholar interprets him. In fact, Alfonsi tells us that Boethius has adopted and inserted the consolatio as the first negative part of protractic. The consolatory part, which by destroying worldly illusions comforts the soul, represents, he tells us, the negative aspect, dialectically serving the positive one, which is in fact a real protractic. Now, in conclusion, as the distinction, I think, between fomenta and remedia in Boethius's medical analogy shows, there appears to be no proper overlap in the consolatio between consolatory and protractic discourses. The apotractic part of the protractic discourse is actually so masterfully stitched to the consolatory discourse that precedes it, in the passage from book 2 to book 3, to create the impression that no solution of continuity subsists between their respective surveys of the goods of fortune. And it's precisely here at this point in the text that derives the apparent, it is from here that derives the apparent strangeness of lady philosophy's method of argumentation in book 2 and book 3. A strangeness that my investigation has hopefully managed to explain. And it is exactly here that I also shall stop. And thank you for your attention, and look forward to receive your questions. Thank you.
Boethius and the text, some of the neglect without context, history of philosophy. Luckily, we have some time for discussion. I would say half an hour, 40 minutes, and I would give the word first to the colleagues online. Yep. I see Elder raising his hand. Of course, Matteo is saying, I knew it already. I did too.
Thank you very much, Matteo, for this presentation. I'm sorry for not being there in person, but in any case, I'm very glad I was able to hear you and to follow your argumentation, which I found very plausible in many points, although I'm very little familiarized with Boethius, but I was very impressed by the meticulousness of your analysis and the richness of details you invoked. So it was all very interesting. And there are 3 points I'm curious about. The first one is the fact that, or is the impression I got that you were trying to reduce in a certain way the genre of consolation to the genre of protractics, as if it was just a part of the genre of protractics. So I was wondering if this emphasis on protractics, or this apparent prevalence of protractics in your analysis, is more due to your starting point and the fact that you are discussing Aristotle, or if it is actually a view about what a consolation is and how it relates with protractics, how these two genres in antiquity relate to each other. The second point concerns the type of protractics that is involved here, and also the type of philosophy, or the notion of philosophy, that is involved in Boethius. Because when we consider classical Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, protreptics is an art of turning oneself to philosophy in the sense of turning oneself to the quest of wisdom. So is turning oneself to an open project that must be fulfilled, that involves many tasks, many transformations. But here, the kind of protreptics involved seems to be a protreptics to philosophy in the sense that the word acquired a bit already in Aristotle, but then later in patristics, of being an equivalent or a synonym for wisdom. So it seems to be simply a turning to a certain wisdom and not a turning to a quest for wisdom. So it seems to be no acknowledgement of human finitude and the openness of philosophy here. So this seems to be a very different conception of protreptics, I think. And I was wondering what you think about that. And the third point concerns the discussion between Nussbaum and Foucault. And that I think also we could also extend to Hadot. So Nussbaum has this idea that the transformative character of philosophy always depends primarily on arguments, and the other aspects, the rhetorical aspects, are derived from that or are secondary. And Foucault and Hadot, on the other hand, see arguments as being just a part or not the most important part. So the formulation may vary, but it doesn't seem to be exactly what Nussbaum says. But in your presentation, it all seemed to be a matter of argument. So I was wondering if there are any other kind of spiritual exercises here that you could see that are independent from arguments, or if the entire consolation and the entire protreptics here is simply argumentative, even though it involves rhetoric. So it would be a richer kind of argument, but always mediated by arguments. In this sense, it would correspond more closely to what Nussbaum says than what Hadot and Foucault often say about ancient philosophy. Thank you.
Great. All right. So we could, I think, stay here for the whole afternoon talking about this elements. All right. So first, concerning many thanks for your questions, Helder. These are very important questions that really go deep into the text, and I'm glad you made them. So the first one concerning the relationship between consolation and protreptics. Actually, I would say as in the last slide has showed, like the reduction of consolation to protreptics is something I would contest myself. In fact, I think that they're actually perfectly stitched one another and they serve different functions. So and the different functions that they perform within the fiction of the text, within the medical analogy, correspond actually to different form of diseases that lady philosophy identifies in Boethius. So, I mean, there have been scholars in literature who argue that that there's really not much difference between the protreptic genre and the consolatory genre, especially for what concerns the use of the goods of fortune. But actually, the position I'm exactly taking is that we cannot reduce one to the other. And I think actually one of the best evidence for not doing that, we can find it here in Boethius Consolatio, I think. So on that side, I would completely agree with your point. Also, the second point is it's very interesting. You're asking me what type of, because this is actually a very unusual, as it were, kind of protreptic discourse that lady philosophy administers to Boethius, or outside of the literary fiction of the text that Boethius administers to himself, right? And why is the biggest difference I could find so far is that Boethius is actually already a philosopher. He has just forgotten how to act as one, right? So he's in need of let's say, a refreshment of his philosophy, and so this is the main difference that I've found so far. While normal protreptic discourses are addressed to novices, right, to people who have never engaged in any philosophical activity, and that's from that fact derives one of the main characteristics of protreptic discourses, which is that they are introductory, they're non-technical, they're not as full of doctrinal material as other kind of discourses. But there is also another interesting point that you pointed out, which is sort of blending of wisdom with philosophy. I don't have an exact answer for that, but there is one of the main scholars that works in this field, which is she's called Sophie van der Meren, who's actually the French editor of the edition of Aristotle Protrepticus. She actually has a paper that deals with this exact ambiguity, and in fact, it seems to be actually one of the elements that connects many protreptic discourses in antiquity is that is this ambiguity. You never know whether they are exhorting to wisdom or they are exhorting to embark on an open project to eventually possibly get to wisdom. Either so there is this fundamental ambiguity that I think you've identified like perfectly, but I don't have. I just know that this is the case. I never got around to ask that question actually. For what concerned your third question, it's certainly. I mean, here therapy, here philosophy as a way of life is. It seems to me to be entirely exercised via discourses. There's no. I cannot see. I mean. Writing it's writing as a spiritual exercise. That's what I would say. But as a counterpoint, I could make that most of these are not really like there is a big part of the Consolatio which deals with specific technical philosophical arguments. But these first three books actually they're based on a lot of rhetorical arguments rather than philosophical. Even the protreptic genre itself works a lot of rhetorics rather than necessarily technical philosophical arguments. But again, I think you're right also on this point. There's no particular exercise beyond the exercise of writing in this case.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very helpful.
Of course.
We cannot hear you, Marcus. Sorry.
I was recalling the text by Hadot, which is included in the selected writings published in 2020. Where he exposes rhetoric and the literary genres as spiritual exercises, in the sense that, yes, in certain texts you actually exhort others or convince others through arguments, but in order to do that, you don't do that like analytic philosophers do it nowadays, right? So the way the arguments are exposed are themselves already prepared or taught as spiritual exercises, probably both for the author, as Matteo was explaining in the case of Boethius, and for the reader. They are written so as to produce that effect on the reader, which, I mean, and I think this is indeed completely contraposed to what Nussbaum says. It's not in the end just the argument that convinces. Not that 1 and 1 plus 1 equals 2, right? You are convinced by an argument through the way it is exposed. And maybe in the end, no, this is already my inference. In the end, maybe you are led through that pathway, not because of the argument itself, but because you are led through the discourse that is presented to you in that way, because that discourse has an impact on you that makes you change your life or whatever. So that in the end, it's not the argument that is decisive for you, this transformation of your way of life, but the way it is presented or the impact the text has on you. I don't know if you agree. This is just something I wanted to add to the discussion between the two of you.
Yeah, I find that plausible. I was just so my difficulty or my problem normally is with Hadot's idea that there are exercises that are not logical, so to say. So the suggestion that there are exercises that are not logical or do not involve directly the logical component. So I have no problems with the fact that rational arguments have a dimension of spiritual exercise. What I find less plausible is that there are other kinds of philosophical spiritual exercise that are not closely connected with logos in some way.
Right.
And I was wondering if there were any of this kind, because they all seem to be very closely connected with arguments. So it was assuming that they were spiritual exercises, they were always mediated by arguments or based on arguments, based on logos.
It's interesting is that actually like scholars agree that the most let's say philosophical part of the Consolatio begins right where it stopped, right when the therapy stopped. So in books 4 and 5, which I haven't considered here, it's something, it's certainly something to think about. Well, I mean, this is an argument that I keep having with a lot of people in different places, and we don't seem to be able to find the end of it. But yeah, it's certainly, I'm gonna read that. I don't remember. Do you remember the title of that article by Hadot? Do you remember? Which rhetoric and something? Okay, that one. Yeah, I'm gonna have to reread that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, I cannot hear you, Marta, again.
It might turn out that logos is not in the end the most important thing.
Yeah, so it might not be the most important thing. So I don't think it's the only thing in any case. I would say it is a necessary thing in any case.
Okay.
And it's also important to emphasize, I think, the logical component in order not to render it completely arbitrary. So it's not simply a rhetorical trick that you use rhetoric as an art to convince other people of whatever, but the quality of the views depends on the logical component as such. So it is important that it is always present.
One of the most interesting parts, one of the most interesting constitutive elements of any protractic writing of antiquity is that, you know, this balance between philosophy and rhetoric. And, you know, and that balance and that relationship is actually structured in a very precise way. And both Aristotle's Protracticus, also Cicero Hortensius, which is these philosophers can use rhetorical arguments with no problems, because as we are told oftentimes also in Boethius Consolatio, because philosophy is considered as being the supreme art, and it is a supreme art because it can turn rhetoric to its best use. So the best user of rhetorical arguments in this context of protracted discourse remains the philosopher somehow, which is, and again, it's an interesting point in and of itself, but yeah, we could certainly expand on this. Thank you, Elder.
Thank you, Oscar.
Please.
Well, I wanted to come back to this difference between between protractic and consolation. How we could say, if we can, that a consolation as a general does it begin? Because it's quite strange now to the fact that the consolation crosses absolutely, because the consolation as a general crosses the genre of a protracticus. For instance, in the two first archetypes, that is the apology of Plato's apology and the Phaedon, and of course also in some of Stoic writings. so it's very interesting also to understand how the consolation as genre differently from the protrepticus is connected, linked to the question of the death. In this case, we have to remember also how historically Consolatio Philosophiae of Boethius is placed. Is the fact it's the last writing of a man that, well, more or less probably, and finally surely will be condemned to death by Theodoricus. And he is the last of Romans, in the sense that he is the last of the representatives of the Latin traditions of philosophy, and sometimes he is also a theologist. He's an extremely important theologist in his debate with the Justinian Byzantine first theologists. So he's very important as a theologist. At the time, his last writing is writing completely not concerning faith, but concerning philosophy. Well, and this last text takes again a form of consolation, the consolation genre that was Stoic and was Platonic. Well, so if you could come back just to this.
I'll do my best. Well, this is actually a very interesting point you're making. Actually, a very famous formula in Boethius studies is to characterize Boethius himself as an author. He's always referred to as the last of the ancients, the last philosopher, as it were, and the first of the scholastics. So again, Boethius stands at the crossroad of a junction of very, very different era and very different ways of conceiving also philosophy. As for the juxtaposition and the use of both the consolatory and the protreptic genre writing, and why would in the world professed Christian resort to, let's say, a genre of writing that was strictly philosophical, let's say. Well, that is very complicated, and I haven't gotten to that point in my presentation, also because that would, I would need to do more research on that point, but the contemporary, I wouldn't say consensus, but there are many contributions in the existing literature on Boethius' Consolatio that argues that whatever kind of philosophical consolation that Lady Philosophy manages to provide Boethius with in the first 3 books, this consolation will be undone in book 4 and book 5. And why is that the case? Some of these scholars have been arguing that the real genre of the Consolatio, notwithstanding its title, is actually a Manichaean satire, which is to say, it is an ancient kind of writings, but according to these scholars, we should read the entire project of self-consolations that Boethius embarks upon as an ironic, as a way of showing the limits of philosophy itself in consoling an individual. So I'm not sure whether I would be ready to commit to such an interpretation. I would need to study a little bit more. But it is interesting. It's certainly plausible, I would say, because if you think of it, the 3rd book, the end of the 3rd book, marks also the end of the therapeutic part of the Consolatio. So the remedies have been administered. Boethius should be, if Boethius really wanted to say that philosophy has some sort of therapeutic power on the soul, why hasn't the Consolatio ended with the 3rd book? You would expect that at the end of the 3rd book, like the continuation in the 4th is just, okay, and Boethius would tell us, yes, I've received the therapy, I'm all better, I'm all turned towards philosophy and nothing. But no, it's, and what the really interesting part of the Consolatio actually starts where I stopped, I think. Yeah, there's certainly more work to be done there. Another interesting aspect is concerning the relationship between protreptics and the consolatory genre, is that apparently, according again to another group of scholars, is usually there are many protreptic elements also in consolatory writings, especially at the end. Usually the ending of a consolatory writings, such as Seneca's consolations, are always an injunction, an exhortation to undertake studies in philosophy, because there's nothing more consolatory in the end than becoming a full-fledged philosopher. But yeah, again, you're pointing at some, with your comments, you're pointing at some of the most critical elements, of course, of this discussion. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. You hear me, Helder? Just a very quick question. It's following on from Gianfranco. I'm just very interested in also the idea of theology and philosophy. Was Boethius, would he have been familiar with this distinction? Had it happened yet? Theology and philosophy, because were they just one and the same? That would be my question. And you're really right. That's what I think for us makes very interesting, that he is that very much that between. He's the last. Is he a pagan or is he a Christian? He's actually a pagan, but he's but then at the same time, there's nothing retrograde about him, because he then leads on to the next 400 or 500 years in scholastic thought. And my last little point is, it was just listening to you, I wonder, did you ever read, or this is a completely different question, the book The Anatomy of Melancholy by Robert Burton? This is it's written in the 17th century. It's a 1500 page, and it just reminds me of Boethius so much. Again, a book written, different circumstances, but someone that's obviously clinically depressed and writes, but he talks a lot about Boethius and others as well. And I just thought, is there a history? Because I don't know Boethius that well, just very superficially, but it just really reminded me. That was just a final thing. Is there a literature there? But that book, The Anatomy of Melancholy, is actually kind of a comic book. It's a very strange, extremely eccentric book of someone trying to survive by writing books about, everything: milk, food, digestion. But it's a beast of a book. But it really reminded me of the consolations of philosophy. So there you go.
Well, yeah, this is, well, the relationship between, well, what we know is, that's another very complicated point to entangle. Well, we know that Boethius, there seems to be no doubt about, in literature, about Boethius's commitment to Christianity. Actually, he actually wrote several treatises in theology before writing all his other works. So he seems to have been rather strongly committed. But if you're asking me whether at the time we could already differentiate between philosophy and theology, well, it's hard to say. It's hard to say. I've read scholars who have suggested exactly that have tried to explain Boethius's silence concerning the Christian dogma in the Consolatio. In fact, there's no mention of any of the Christian dogmas in the Consolatio, and I've heard scholars suggesting that's precisely the reason, because he didn't really differentiate much between the truth that the philosopher had reached, let's say, by discourse and the Christian dogma, which is actually a rather common position has been a rather common position for the Christian fathers. Augustine has that position in many writings.
Because is Boethius in? Where is he? Is he in? He's That would be helpful. Where is he? Okay.
Can you just remember? No, not in hell. But I'm certain he's there, and he's actually an important point of reference for Dante in the book, but I can't quite remember where. This is I never thought about it. If someone could, please. Otherwise, I'm just gonna not sleep tonight. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah. It is absolutely, it could be an interesting, Well, what is very speaking is very interesting. I remember.
Do you want to come here? Yeah, because otherwise they won't.
It's very interesting because well, I remember that Boethius stayed in paradise.
Right.
No, in the fourth sky of paradise. But what is interesting here is that he forms with the other 11 sprites the crown of the crown of sprites of the sky. So it's a very important figure, Dante.
Okay.
But what is biographically important for Dante is the fact that he read the first book he read after Beatrice's death is precisely the consolation of philosophy. So it is very important, very pivotal for Dante too. Yeah, precisely. Yes. And then, well, I'm just the last question. It's the fact that I link your presence with the presence of Martha here. The fact that, she specialist of the philosophy as therapy of therapy. So it's very interesting to remember to understand how these two therapies that Boethius practices, in the Consolatio, and one of these, of course, is not the first one. Also, the Epicurean Stoicism. He has a great tradition before him, but at the same time, it differences these therapies. And what is interesting for me, it's the first one. This therapy of the morbus lethargicus. That implies a sort of awakening, precisely this. And it's quite interesting because a lot of writings in a humanist time, for instance, take again precisely this idea of awakening as a philosophical aim, and Thomas More for first.
Thank you for your qualification. And wow, yeah, this was interesting. The parallel with Dante. Right. Well, it's interesting. Yeah, of course, the medical analogy, it has been so far one of the, because it is present usually traditionally, both in consolatory writings, of course, and also in protractic writings, and also everywhere else, perhaps in antiquity, in ancient philosophical writings. But it has been, I think, a factor in the confusion that some scholars have had. It has been one of the reasons why scholars, I think, have illicitly conflated the protractic and the consolatory writing, I would say. And because they found the similarities, or, for example, they have noted that both genres of writing make use of the theme, the topos of the goods of fortune. And so they have been, I think, confused on this point, but I mean, I would be inclined to again keep them. Of course, there are many overlaps, but there are different forms of discourse, and if you look at them, especially precisely within the context of the medical analogy of the conception of philosophy as therapy, I think Boethius' text gives us at least one piece of evidence and gives us some reason to differentiate them. Yeah?
Online, I think I can still, it's not really a question, it's more like a comment. Actually, two comments. The last one occurred to me when I was listening to Franco. When we insert Boethius in the tradition of philosophy as therapy, or when we compare the kind of therapy at stake in this text and the Stoics, Epicureans, the Hellenistic schools in general, seems to me that in Boethius there's a lot less dogmatic vision of philosophy, or at least there is no specific or dogmatic way of life that is recommended, so to say. Right. So the reader is somehow exhorted to philosophy, but without and with the promise of happiness, right? But there is the way to get there is not so specific. So you know that philosophy is the way, but you don't have so specific rules as you might have with the elements.
Right.
The second comment is really just a comment. I will just think out loud. That in this context of the importance of the genres and of the intention of the author, something in which Hadot insists a lot, Boethius seems to have a very peculiar role here, because he's both the patient and the doctor, right? When he's writing, he's also Lady Philosophy. He's the one who is suffering from the lack of philosophy, right? But he also knows what is the perspective of philosophy. Yeah. So, and of course, then the text has this double. So you said, I think very well, that he has been a philosopher, but has somehow forgotten, and he's trying to recall himself of that. And then I remembered, for example, Marcus Aurelius in his Meditations, which is a frequent example by Hadot. But when he's writing the Meditations, he's trying to recall for himself the main principles of the school, and that by writing them down, he's like trying to incorporate them, and by giving rise to a book, he's also teaching others to. So how would you relate Boethius to Marcus Aurelius, for example? Because Marcus Aurelius doesn't seem to ever have been on the other side, let's say. This idea that you know how to be a wise, or that you have been wise, and you lose that capacity, somewhat strange. It's either you are on the way and you are just trying to reinforce the force of the truth in you so that you keep going, but this process of having been there and then losing and trying to recall, it's a strange position, isn't it? I can't remember any equivalent.
That's very true. Okay, you're giving me a lot to think of. So let me first unpack your first comment. Concerning the dogmatic element, that is a very it's very interesting. But we never, again, this is probably true up to book 3. Again, the following books are somewhat more. I mean, scholars have argued that the real dogmatic part starts somehow in book 4 and 5 of the element, and we don't know how much the absence of thematic elements in the first 3 books is to be explained by reference to the kind of discourses that Boethius is administering himself. For example, consolatory and protractic discourses are traditionally non-dogmatic discourses, especially because both of them were actually directed to non-philosophers most of the time. That's right, because the consolatory discourses were a way of in fact, consoling people that did not have most of the time did not have the possibility to devote themselves. Look at to philosophy. Look at like even Seneca's consolations, for example, ad martiam, etc., etc. And the same, it's true for the protractic discourse. So again, I don't know how much the absence of dogmatic elements in Boethius Consolatio reflects just the use of that he makes of his discourses. And that, well, that complexity, for what concerned your second question concerning the complexity of that Boethius being both the patient and the doctor, the one that administers himself his treatments. Again, as I noted before, this is also one of the main innovations that he brings to the very genre of protractic writings. Because, for example, we have a self-consolation. Cicero, for example, wrote a self-consolation. But we never, there's never been a self-protractic, because you would think, why in the world would you need to exhort yourself again, right? And this is interesting. It's an interesting part. I thought a bit about it. And he does seem to occupy a very similar position as Marcus Aurelius, right? You would think this is someone that is writing, but the difference again is that Boethius is writing to, I would say Marcus Aurelius is a fully converted Stoics, which is trying to keep alive, let's say, the precepta, the principles of conduct, right? And he's doing that by writing. What Boethius is doing, perhaps, he finds himself in the very same position of writing to himself, but in an even weirder context, because he's the one which is trying to re-exhort himself to convert to philosophy somehow, which is a very complicated position to be in. And this is actually one of the, I would say that this is one of the main reasons, exactly the circular relationship. It is one of the main reasons why it wouldn't make sense to say that this text is a text which is trying to convey some knowledge concerning philosophy. Because why would you, how could you be at the same time the one receiving a form of knowledge and giving it, right? How could you be unaware of some philosophical knowledge and giving it to yourself? Perhaps just reactualizing it, as Marcus is doing. I don't know.
To convey an experience.
That's
right. But it seems to be a past experience. If you don't know the context when the work was written, it seems to you that Boethius is recalling his own conversion to philosophy, something that happened before, and it's just telling others so that others might go through the same experience. But it doesn't seem like credible that you are suffering from lethargy and you are able to either or that you have forgotten yourself and you are able at the same time to tell you that you have forgotten yourself.
That's right. Well, right. Well, then concerning the lethargy, that's an interesting point. Concerning the lethargic, I mean, but you can be, let's say, aware that you're not being able to respond to circumstances as a philosopher would, right? You can certainly be a philosopher. You could have certainly be a philosopher, and then I would say not forget philosophy, but forget how to react to many vicissitudes as a philosopher would do. And in fact, you could need some encouragement to, I don't know, to reactivate that identity for yourself, if that makes sense. But again, yeah, that is a complex position, and it allows for a lot of, that's right, and yeah.
Nobody else has questions, we can close this session. Thank you all for being here and there. And this was the last session this academic year, but if all goes well, we'll come back in October. So See you soon. Thank you.